Have you ever judged someone based on their appearance, only to find out later how wrong you were? Sometimes, our snap judgments can lead to shocking consequences, and today's story is proof of that. Text. Imagine a bustling, upscale restaurant where waiters in crisp uniforms glide between tables, serving perfectly plated dishes to elegant diners. The air is filled with the hum of conversations and the clinking of glasses. It's the kind of place where people go to celebrate life's big moments. In the middle of all this, a man named Jake works as a waiter. Jake is ambitious, confident, and quick on his feet, but he's also quick to judge. To him, the restaurant's reputation is everything, and he believes it's his job to keep the wrong kind of people out. One evening, as the dinner rush is in full swing, the front door opens, and in walks an elderly woman. She's dressed simply, with a gentle smile that suggests she's not there to impress anyone. Jake notices her immediately, and instead of seeing a customer, he sees a problem. What happens next is a tale of arrogance, humility, and a twist you won't see coming. Stay with us until the end, because this story doesn't just teach Jake a lesson, it might just change the way you look at the world around you. Ready to dive in? Let's get started. The elderly woman stepped inside, her eyes lighting up as she took in the warm, inviting atmosphere of the restaurant. She paused for a moment, looking around as if savoring the ambience. But to Jake, the sight of her only confirmed his assumptions. Her plain clothing and hesitant demeanor stood out in a place filled with designer outfits and polished confidence. Jake sighed, adjusting his tie as he approached her table. He didn't even bother to hide his annoyance. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone clipped and indifferent. The woman looked up with a kind smile. "Yes, I'd love to see a menu," she said, her voice soft but full of warmth. Jake hesitated for a moment, glancing around to see if anyone else was watching. Then, with a forced smile, he replied, "Are you sure, ma'am? This isn't exactly casual dining. There's a diner just a block down the street. Might be more your style." The woman blinked, surprised but not offended. "Oh, I've heard wonderful things about this place," she said cheerfully. "I've been looking forward to trying it for a long time." Jake crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. "Our dishes are a little on the pricey side," he said bluntly, leaning closer as if to emphasize the point. But the woman didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled again and said, "That's all right. I'd like to stay." Jake let out a quiet, exasperated sigh. "I'll grab you a menu," he muttered, walking away, though his expression made it clear he didn't think she deserved one. As Jake moved behind the counter, he exchanged glances with another waiter, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Jake shook his head. "I'm telling you, she's not ordering anything. Probably just here to waste time." The other waiter shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with Jake's attitude but unwilling to challenge him. After all, Jake had a reputation for being sharp-tongued, and most of the staff preferred to avoid conflict with him. Meanwhile, the woman sat patiently at her table, unaware or perhaps unbothered by the growing tension around her. She seemed content, her hands folded neatly in front of her as she waited for someone to take her order. But Jake wasn't planning to give her the chance. What he didn't know was that his decision to dismiss her so quickly would soon backfire in a way he could never have imagined. And this is where things start to get really interesting. Stick around, because the twist in this story will leave you speechless. Jake returned to the table, this time without a menu. His smile was then more like a mask than a gesture of kindness. He leaned slightly over the table, his tone dripping with condescension. "Ma'am, I'm going to be honest with you. This is a very busy evening, and our tables are in high demand. If you're not ready to order, I'll have to ask you to free up the space for other guests." The elderly woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet dignity. "I understand," she said softly, "but I really would like to order something. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time." Jake's patience finally snapped. "Look," he said sharply, "this is a fine dining establishment. We don't serve just anyone who walks in off the street. If you want a meal, I suggest you try somewhere more appropriate." The woman's face fell for the first time, but even then, she remained composed. "I see," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stood up slowly, steadying herself with the edge of the table. "I'm sorry to have troubled you." Without another word, she turned and began walking toward the door. Her steps were slow, deliberate, and a little unsteady. For a moment, The restaurant seemed to pause. A few diners glanced in her direction, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The other staff members exchanged uneasy looks, but no one intervened. Jake watched her go, feeling a fleeting twinge of guilt, but he quickly brushed it aside, convincing himself he'd done the right thing. After all, wasn't it his job to maintain the restaurant's image? He smirked to himself as he returned to the counter, muttering under his breath, she wouldn't have ordered anything anyway. The rest of the evening continued as usual. Jake, confident he'd handled the situation perfectly, went back to charming the high-paying customers and keeping things running smoothly. To him, the elderly woman was already a forgotten inconvenience. But what Jake didn't realize was that the story was far from over. The woman who had just walked out wasn't some ordinary diner, and by the end of the night, Jake would come to regret every word he'd said to her. What happens next will completely turn the tables not just on Jake, but on everyone who witnessed the scene. Trust me, you'll want to hear this. Keep watching, because the twist is about to unfold. The restaurant buzzed on, the hum of conversation and clinking silverware filling the air. Jake continued his shift, his confidence unshaken, oblivious to the storm brewing just outside his world. To him, the evening was like any other, serving the elite, catering to their whims, and making sure the restaurant's high standards were upheld. As the night began to wind down, the restaurant manager, a sharp-eyed man named Richard, stepped out of his office. He scanned the room with a serious expression, clearly looking for someone. His gaze landed on Jake, and with a brisk nod, he motioned for him to come over. Jake, Richard began, his tone firm, we're about to have a very important guest. I need you on your best behavior. Jake straightened up, his curiosity piqued. Who is it? He asked, his voice laced with intrigue. Richard hesitated for a moment, lowering his voice. The owner of this restaurant is stopping by. She rarely visits, but when she does, it's a big deal. Everything needs to be perfect. Jake blinked, taken aback. The owner, he'd worked at the restaurant for over a year and had never seen or heard much about her. The staff spoke of her like a legend, someone who had built the place from scratch but preferred to stay out of the spotlight. Got it, Jake said quickly, adjusting his uniform and running a hand through his hair. He felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was his chance to impress someone truly important, someone who could potentially elevate his career. Just then, the front door opened. Jake turned, his polished smile already in place. But as the figure stepped inside, his smile froze. It was her. The elderly woman he had dismissed earlier, the one he had refused to serve, was now walking back into the restaurant. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Richard was by her side, his demeanor respectful and almost reverent. Jake's heart sank as the pieces began to fall into place. This couldn't be real. She's the owner. Richard gestured toward the center of the dining room, clearing a table personally for her. The other staff members were whispering among themselves, their eyes darting between Jake and the woman. The tension in the room was palpable. Jake stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. He replayed their earlier interaction in his head, every word he had said to her now echoing back with crushing clarity. His face flushed red as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The woman, now seated comfortably, glanced in Jake's direction. Her expression was calm, almost unreadable, but there was no mistaking the quiet authority in her gaze. Jake swallowed hard, the weight of her unspoken judgment heavier than anything he had ever felt before. And just like that, the tables had turned. What happens next will leave Jake and everyone watching in complete shock. The owner has something to say, and it's a lesson no one in that restaurant will ever forget. Stay with us, because the moment of truth is coming. The dining room felt unusually quiet now, the buzz of conversation subdued as the staff and diners alike waited to see what would unfold. Jake stood near the counter, frozen in place, his usual confidence replaced with sheer panic. Richard approached Jake, motioning for him to come over. Jake, I want you to meet Mrs. Evelyn Hart, he said, his voice tinged with a mix of respect and formality. She's the founder and owner of this restaurant. Jake's throat went dry as he forced himself to step forward. Mrs. Hart turned her gaze to him, her expression calm but piercing, like she could see straight through him. We've met, she said simply, her voice soft yet commanding. The weight of those words made Jake flinch. His mind scrambled for anything to say. I didn't realize, he stammered, his usual sharp tongue now clumsy and unsure. Mrs. Hart tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Didn't realize what, young man? She asked, her tone measured but with a hint of steel. Jake's face burned with embarrassment. "I didn't know who you were," he blurted out, immediately regretting the words. Mrs. Hart leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "And does that change how you treat someone?" she asked, her question landing like a hammer. Jake's heart sank further. The room was utterly silent now, every pair of eyes locked on the exchange. I'm sorry, ma'am," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't thinking." Mrs. Hart regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, her tone calm but laced with authority. "This restaurant was built on the idea that everyone deserves to feel welcome. I started it with nothing but a dream and a belief that kindness could be just as important as good food." Her words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. She continued, "What I witnessed earlier today was not the spirit of this place. It was the opposite. And it's something I cannot tolerate." Jake felt his stomach twist. The shame was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the realization of how badly he had failed, not just as a waiter, but as a person. Mrs. Hart looked around the room, addressing not just Jake but the entire staff. "We don't judge people by their clothes, their age, or their appearance. If we can't treat every guest with respect, then we have no business being in hospitality." She paused, letting the lesson sink in. Then her gaze returned to Jake. "Tell me," she said, her voice softer now but no less firm, "do you believe in second chances?" Jake blinked, unsure how to respond. The question felt like a lifeline and a challenge all at once. "Yes," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I do." Mrs. Hart nodded slowly. "Good, because I do too. But second chances are earned, not given freely. Starting tomorrow, you'll have the opportunity to show me what you've learned." The tension in Jake's shoulders eased slightly, but the weight of her words still pressed down on him. He knew this wasn't just about keeping his job, it was about proving he could change. What Jake didn't know was that this second chance would push him to grow in ways he never imagined. The lesson he was about to learn wouldn't just change his career, it would change his life. And as the evening continued, the restaurant itself would never be the same again. Stay tuned, because the ripple effects of this moment are only just beginning. The restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the air was still charged with the weight of what had just happened. Jake, now more subdued than ever, stood off to the side, watching as Mrs. Hart spoke with Richard and a few other staff members. Though she wore a warm smile, her presence carried an undeniable authority. Jake couldn't shake the shame that clung to him. Every time he replayed the scene in his mind, his dismissive tone, his rude comments, the way he judged her so quickly, it felt like a fresh wound. He had been so sure of himself, so certain he was doing the right thing, and now he saw just how wrong he had been. As the evening wound down, Mrs. Hart rose from her seat and began to make her way toward the exit. Jake's pulse quickened when she paused near him, her calm gaze meeting his once again. "I expect better," she said softly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Not just from you, but from everyone here. You have the potential to do better, don't waste it." Jake nodded, unable to find the words to respond. As she walked out, the entire staff seemed to exhale, as if they'd all been holding their breath. Once the doors closed behind her, Richard approached Jake. His usual briskness was tempered with something almost like pity. "You're lucky," he said, folding his arms. "Most people wouldn't have given you a second chance after that. She believes in people, but you'd better not let her down." Jake nodded again, his throat tight. "I won't," he said quietly, though the weight of the promise felt enormous. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. The memory of Mrs. Hart's calm but firm words played on a loop in his mind. He thought about her story, how she'd built the restaurant from nothing, how much it meant to her. He thought about her kindness, even in the face of his disrespect. And most of all, he thought about the kind of person he wanted to be. The next day, Jake arrived at the restaurant early, determined to make things right. He started small, going out of his way to greet every customer with genuine warmth. He apologized to his coworkers for his attitude the night before, promising to be a better team player. At first, the change felt awkward, almost forced. But as the days turned into weeks, Jake found that treating people with kindness wasn't just about doing his job, it was about rediscovering his own humanity. Mrs. Hart returned to the restaurant a few weeks later, this time as an unannounced guest. She watched quietly from a corner table as Jake worked, noting the difference in his demeanor. He moved with purpose and humility, treating every customer with the same level of respect, no matter who they were. When she finally called him over, Jake approached with a mix of nervousness and hope. "Mrs. Hart," he began, his voice steady but humble. "Thank you for giving me another chance. I've learned a lot since that night." Mrs. Hart smiled, the warmth in her eyes unmistakable. "Good," she said, "because this restaurant isn't just about food, it's about people. And people can always grow, as long as they're willing to try." For Jake, those words became a guiding principle not just in his work, but in his life. And for the restaurant, the incident became a story that shaped its culture, reminding everyone that kindness and respect are the true hallmarks of success. This wasn't just a lesson for Jake. It was a lesson for everyone, and it's a reminder we could all use. Never underestimate the power of humility, and never judge a book by its cover. Because sometimes, the person you least expect has the most to teach you. Jake's transformation didn't go unnoticed. Regular customers who had once found him curt and impersonal now praised his attentive service and genuine demeanor. His coworkers, initially skeptical of his change, began to warm up to him as he offered to help with tasks he used to avoid. Slowly but surely, Jake was earning back the respect he had lost. One day, a middle-aged man walked into the restaurant wearing a worn jacket and carrying a small notebook. He sat at a table near the window, looking out of place among the other diners in their suits and dresses. Jake was assigned to his table. For a brief moment, the old Jake threatened to resurface. The man's appearance was far from the polished clientele Jake was used to serving, but he quickly shook off the thought, reminding himself of Mrs. Hart's words. He approached the table with a smile. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Hart's. May I bring you a menu?" The man looked up, surprised by Jake's warm tone. "Oh yes, please," he said, his voice hesitant. "Thank you." Throughout the meal, Jake treated the man with the same care and respect he gave to every customer. He offered recommendations, refilled his water without being asked, and even struck up a friendly conversation. By the end of the evening, the man seemed genuinely touched by the experience. As the man prepared to leave, he handed Jake a folded note along with his payment. "Thank you for your kindness," he said simply before walking out the door. Curious, Jake opened the note. Inside was a heartfelt message. "In a world that often overlooks people like me, you made me feel seen and valued. Thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists. You've inspired me more than you know." Jake felt a lump in his throat as he read the words. For the first time, he truly understood the impact of his actions not just on the restaurant's reputation, but on the lives of the people who walked through its doors. That evening, as Jake shared the note with his coworkers, it sparked a new energy among the staff. They began to see their roles not just as waiters, cooks, or hosts, but as part of something larger, a place where people could find warmth and connection, no matter who they were. When Mrs. Hart visited the restaurant again, Jake shared the note with her. She read it carefully, her eyes glistening with pride. "This is why I started this restaurant," she said softly. "Not just to serve food, but to serve humanity." Jake nodded, his heart full. "I get it now," he said. "It's not about who walks through the door, it's about how we make them feel when they're here." Mrs. Hart smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've come a long way, Jake. Keep going. The world needs more of this." From that day on, Jake became a leader in the restaurant, mentoring new staff and ensuring Mrs. Hart's vision was upheld. The restaurant thrived, not just because of its food, but because of the heart and soul behind every interaction. And Jake, he carried the lesson with him wherever he went, proving that it's never too late to grow, change, and make a difference. Months passed, and the story of Jake's transformation became a part of the restaurant's legend. Regular customers, especially those who had been dining there for years, noticed the shift in atmosphere. The warmth that filled the air was no longer just a product of the exquisite meals, it was in the way the staff interacted with each guest, making everyone feel like family. Jake, now a model employee, continued to prove himself day by day. His newfound respect for the customers, no matter their appearance or background, became a hallmark of the restaurant. The team was closer than ever, working together seamlessly, and morale was at an all-time high. But Jake's journey wasn't just about proving himself to others, it was about proving something to himself. The confidence that had once been rooted in arrogance was now grounded in humility. He had learned that respect, kindness, and a willingness to listen were far more powerful than the judgment he had once relied on. One evening, a couple came in to celebrate their anniversary. They were an older pair, with graying hair and smiles that spoke of decades spent together. As they sat down, Jake recognized the woman immediately. She was the same elderly woman who had walked in that fateful night, the one he had dismissed so harshly. But now, she wasn't just another guest. She was someone Jake deeply admired, and someone he had come to respect. He approached the table with a genuine smile. "Good evening, ma'am. It's a pleasure to have you here tonight. How can I make your anniversary celebration special?" he asked, his voice filled with sincerity. The woman's eyes twinkled as she looked up at him. "You've come a long way, Jake," she said warmly. "I see you've learned something valuable." Jake smiled, feeling a rush of gratitude. "I've learned a lot, actually, and I'm still learning." The couple enjoyed their meal, and Jake took care of them with the utmost attention, ensuring every detail was perfect. By the end of the evening, they were both smiling and thanking him for making their night unforgettable. As they left, the woman turned to Jake one last time. "You've turned this place into something special. Keep going. The world needs more people like you." Jake watched them walk out, the weight of her words settling in. He felt a deep sense of pride, but also a renewed commitment to continue growing and helping others see the value in kindness. Later that night, as Jake was cleaning up after the dinner rush, Mrs. Hart approached him once again. She had been observing the entire exchange from across the room. "You handled that beautifully," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You've learned what I've always known, that kindness is the most important ingredient in any meal." Jake smiled, his heart full. "Thank you, Mrs. Hart. I think I finally understand what you meant when you said this place isn't just about food. It's about people." Mrs. Hart nodded, her eyes sparkling with satisfaction. "Exactly. And now, you're not just serving food. You're serving something much more meaningful." Jake knew in that moment that his journey wasn't over. There would always be more to learn, more ways to grow, and more opportunities to make a difference. But one thing was clear: he had found his true purpose. And it all started with a single lesson that kindness, respect, and humility could turn any mistake into an opportunity for growth. The ripple effect of that one moment had not only transformed Jake's life, but it had changed the culture of the entire restaurant. As the night ended and Jake walked out of the restaurant, he couldn't help but smile. The world had a way of surprising you, of showing you who you could become if you were willing to change. And for Jake, that journey had only just begun. In the end, this story isn't just about one man's redemption. It's about how each of us can make a difference by showing kindness, by never judging others too quickly, and by always being open to learning. Because sometimes, the biggest lessons come from the most unexpected places. As Jake walked through the doors of the restaurant that morning, there was a renewed sense of purpose in his step. The lessons he had learned had become part of his daily life, not just at work but in everything he did. The transformation had been profound, and the journey had taught him something invaluable. True success wasn't about what you achieved alone, but about the relationships you built along the way. Word of Jake's growth had spread beyond the restaurant walls. Other staff members began to approach him for advice, not just about customer service but about how to handle difficult situations with grace. Jake had become a mentor, and in many ways, a living testament to the power of second chances. But the most powerful change was seen in the restaurant itself. As the staff embraced the culture of kindness and respect, the guests felt it too. The restaurant's reputation flourished not just for its exceptional food, but for the way every person who walked through the door was treated like they mattered. Then, one fateful evening, Mrs. Hart called Jake into her office. The moment felt surreal. He hadn't been called in for anything serious in months, and now, as he stood before her, a sense of nervous excitement washed over him. "Jake," she began, her voice steady but warm, "you've come a long way, and I've been watching your progress. Your transformation has been remarkable." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Thank you, Mrs. Hart. It means a lot to hear that from you." Mrs. Hart smiled, her eyes twinkling with a knowing glint. "I think it's time for you to take on a new challenge." She nodded. "Yes. I'd like to offer you a leadership role here at the restaurant." "You've earned it." Jake was stunned. The idea of becoming a leader at the very place where he had once made such a grave mistake felt almost surreal. But as he looked at Mrs. Hart, he realized something important. This wasn't just a job offer. It was an opportunity to continue living the values that had reshaped his life. "Are you sure?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, I still have so much to learn." Mrs. Hart chuckled softly. "We all have something to learn, Jake. But you've shown that you understand what truly matters. And that's the foundation of great leadership." Jake stood there for a moment, processing the weight of the decision. He thought back to the first time he had met Mrs. Hart, the moment he had treated her with disdain. He thought about all the times he had failed and how each one had taught him something important. Finally, he spoke, his voice filled with gratitude. "I accept. I won't let you down." Mrs. Hart's smile widened. "I know you won't." And so, Jake stepped into his new role as a leader, not because of his position, but because he had earned the respect of everyone around him. He became the embodiment of the very values Mrs. Hart had instilled in the restaurant from the start: kindness, humility, and the belief that every person, no matter their background, deserved respect. In the months that followed, Jake continued to inspire others. His story became a symbol of redemption, a reminder that anyone, no matter their past, could change for the better. And as he led the restaurant into a new era, he never forgot the lesson that had started it all: that the true heart of a place lies not in its food or its walls, but in the way people are treated. As for Mrs. Hart, she watched from the sidelines, proud of the young men who had come so far. She knew that the restaurant was in good hands. And, just as importantly, she knew that the values they had built together would live on, because in the end, it wasn't just about serving food, it was about serving people. And that, Jake realized, was the greatest gift of all. The days turned into weeks, and Jake's leadership continued to shine. As the new manager, he embraced his role with humility and dedication. He wasn't just overseeing the daily operations of the restaurant. He was creating an environment where everyone felt valued, staff and guests alike. He made sure to pass on the lessons Mrs. Hart had taught him, reminding everyone that kindness was the backbone of their success. The restaurant flourished under Jake's guidance. He implemented training programs for the staff, focusing on customer service, teamwork, and the importance of empathy. No one was too busy to listen, and no one was overlooked. The energy in the restaurant was contagious. Guests returned not just for the delicious food, but for the atmosphere of warmth and care that radiated from every corner. But Jake didn't just focus on improving the restaurant's operations. He began working closely with Mrs. Hart, learning the ins and outs of managing a business. Her mentorship continued to shape his understanding of leadership. He came to admire not just her wisdom, but the quiet strength that allowed her to build an empire from the ground up. One day, Jake and Mrs. Hart sat down for coffee after a busy lunch rush. They were talking about the future, about where they wanted the restaurant to go. "You've done more than I ever imagined, Jake," Mrs. Hart said, looking at him with pride. "But I'm curious what's next for you. You've proven yourself here, but do you have any bigger dreams?" Jake took a deep breath, thinking carefully about her question. He had always been so focused on the present, on making things right after his mistake, that he hadn't stopped to think about what came next. "I want to keep growing," Jake said finally, his voice filled with conviction. "Not just as a leader here, but as a person. I want to help others who were in my shoes, who think they can't change. I want to show them that it's possible to turn things around." Mrs. Hart smiled knowingly. "I think that's exactly the right mindset. People like you, Jake, have the power to inspire change. But remember, change starts with yourself. Lead by example, and others will follow." As Jake reflected on her words, he realized that his journey wasn't just about running a successful restaurant. It was about leading with integrity, inspiring others, and helping them realize their own potential. The next few months brought new challenges, but Jake was ready. He became more involved in the community, partnering with local organizations and hosting events that brought people together. The restaurant became a hub for charitable efforts, a place where the spirit of giving was just as important as the food on the table. Through it all, Jake never lost sight of the lesson that had started it all: kindness was the foundation of everything. Whether he was training a new employee, handling a difficult customer, or giving back to the community, Jake approached each situation with the same level of respect and care. And as the years went by, the restaurant's legacy continued to grow, not just as a successful business, but as a place that touched lives. Jake's story became an inspiration to everyone who heard it, a reminder that redemption is possible, that people can change, and that kindness is always the answer. Jake's journey, from the arrogant waiter to the compassionate leader, had come full circle. He had found his purpose, and he was living it every day. And as he looked around at the thriving restaurant, at the happy customers, and the dedicated staff, he knew that he had truly become the person Mrs. Hart had always believed he could be. For Jake, The greatest reward wasn't the success of the restaurant or the recognition he had earned, it was the knowledge that he had made a real difference in the lives of those around him. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered. The restaurant continued to thrive, but Jake's impact extended far beyond its walls. His story, a story of redemption, growth, and kindness, was shared by all who worked there. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest success comes not from what you achieve, but from the lives you touch along the way. And as the years went on, Jake remained a constant presence, leading with humility, serving with heart, and always remembering the lesson that had changed everything. The lesson that no matter where you start, you can always choose a different path. As Jake continued to lead the restaurant, his story began to ripple out, touching more lives than he could have ever imagined. People who visited the restaurant regularly began to notice the change, not just in the service, but in the atmosphere. The once cold, transactional environment had transformed into a place where warmth, respect, and care were felt in every corner. One evening, a family of four walked into the restaurant. They were a young couple with 2 children, and as they sat down, Jake recognized them immediately. They had been regulars for years, but tonight, they seemed different. The father looked tired, his face drawn, and the mother appeared a bit distracted. The children were unusually quiet, fidgeting in their seats. Jake knew something wasn't right. He approached their table with a smile, his concern masked behind his professionalism. "Good evening. How's everyone doing tonight?" he asked, his tone soft and welcoming. The mother smiled weakly. "We're all right. Just been a tough day. That's all." Jake could sense that there was more to it, so he took a different approach. "If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask," he said, his voice sincere. After a few moments of quiet conversation, the father looked up at Jake, his eyes filled with exhaustion. "Actually," he said slowly, "we've been going through a rough patch lately. Work has been stressful, and we've been struggling to find some balance." Jake listened intently, nodding in understanding. He didn't rush to offer solutions. Instead, he simply provided a listening ear. The family began to open up, talking about their struggles and how they had been finding it difficult to connect with each other amid their busy lives. By the time their meal arrived, there was a noticeable shift. The family seemed more at ease, their shoulders less tense, and their conversation flowed more freely. Jake made sure to check in on them periodically, offering support without being intrusive. As they finished their meal, the father caught Jake's eye. "You've made this a lot easier," he said, his voice sincere. "It's rare to find someone who truly listens these days. Thank you." Jake smiled, his heart warmed by the simple words, "It's my pleasure." Sometimes, all it takes is someone to hear you out. As the family left, the mother smiled at Jake. "You've made our night better than we thought it could be. Thank you for your kindness." Jake watched them leave, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This was why he had embraced the values he had learned, because sometimes a little kindness was all it took to turn a tough day around. Later that evening, Jake reflected on the encounter. It wasn't just about the food or the service. It was about being there for people when they needed it most. He thought back to the moment when he had been given a second chance by Mrs. Hart. He had been given the opportunity to make a difference, and he was determined to do so every day. His leadership, built on kindness, humility, and respect, was beginning to have an impact far beyond the walls of the restaurant. It was changing the lives of those who walked through the door, just as it had changed his own life. Jake's journey had taught him that true leadership wasn't about authority, it was about empathy. It was about seeing people for who they were, understanding their struggles, and offering support without judgment. And it was in those moments, when people felt heard and valued, that real change could happen. The restaurant continued to thrive, but it was no longer just a place for food, it was a sanctuary, a space where people could come, share their stories, and find comfort in the kindness of others. Jake had created a culture of care, and it was spreading like wildfire. And as he looked around at the happy faces of his team, the loyal customers, and the guests who came seeking not just a meal, but a moment of connection, Jake knew that he had found his true calling. He wasn't just managing a restaurant, he was building a community. As the years went by, Jake's story continued to inspire. He became known not just as a manager, but as someone who had changed the way people thought about service, leadership, and the power of kindness. He had turned his own mistakes into opportunities for growth, and now he was helping others do the same. And so, the legacy of the restaurant grew. It wasn't just a place to eat, it was a place where lives were touched, where hearts were healed, and where people learned the true meaning of respect and compassion. Jake's journey had come full circle, and as he stood in the restaurant that had been the backdrop of his transformation, he knew that he had made a difference. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered. As the years continued to pass, Jake's leadership became more than just about managing the restaurant. It was about cultivating a culture that would last far beyond the walls of the establishment. He became a beacon of inspiration for his team, always emphasizing that the heart of the restaurant was its people, both staff and guests. Jake's philosophy, rooted in kindness and respect, began to influence every aspect of the business. From the smallest detail, like greeting each guest with a smile, to the bigger picture of the restaurant's community outreach programs, the entire operation thrived on a foundation of empathy and human connection. He encouraged the team to take the time to truly understand their guests' needs, to listen actively, and to offer service that went beyond what was expected. One day, Jake was approached by a young woman who had just started working as a server. She had heard about Jake's transformation and wanted to learn more about how he had turned things around. Jake was always eager to share his story, but this time, the conversation was different. The young woman sat down with him during a slow afternoon shift. "Jake, I've heard so much about how you turn things around here, but honestly, I don't know where to even start. I've only been here for a few weeks, and I'm struggling to find my place." Jake looked at her thoughtfully, recognizing the uncertainty in her eyes. He smiled, leaning forward. "You don't need to have it all figured out right away. What matters most is that you're open to learning and growing. This restaurant isn't just about serving food, it's about serving people. If you can make someone feel seen and valued, you're doing your job well." The young woman nodded, taking in his words. "But how did you learn to change? I mean, you weren't always like this, right?" Jake chuckled, remembering the person he used to be. "No, I wasn't. I had to make a lot of mistakes to get here. But one thing I learned along the way is that no matter what, people always remember how you make them feel. That's the key to everything." As Jake spoke, the young woman's face lit up with understanding. "So, it's not just about the service, it's about the connection." "Exactly," Jake said. "The food is important, sure. But what keeps people coming back isn't just a great meal. It's the way they're treated. It's the experience they have, the feeling that they matter. When you create that kind of environment, the rest will follow." Over the next few weeks, the young woman began to put Jake's advice into practice. She started to focus on connecting with the guests, learning their names, asking about their day, and genuinely listening to their responses. Slowly but surely, she found herself becoming more confident in her role. One evening, after a particularly busy shift, the young woman approached Jake again. This time, there was a noticeable difference in her demeanor. She stood a little taller, her eyes shining with excitement. "Jake, I just had the best conversation with a couple at table 4. They were celebrating their anniversary, and I really took the time to talk to them about it. They were so grateful, and I could tell they felt so special. I get it now. I see what you mean about making a connection." Jake smiled, proud of her growth. "That's exactly it. You're not just a server, you're part of their experience. And when you treat people like they matter, you're making an impact." As time went on, the young woman blossomed into a valuable member of the team. She became one of the restaurant's most beloved servers, known for her warmth and attention to detail. Her transformation was a testament to the power of the culture Jake had built. It wasn't just about teaching the mechanics of good service, it was about teaching people to care. Meanwhile, the restaurant's reputation continued to grow. Word of mouth spread far and wide, not just about the delicious food, but about the incredible atmosphere that made everyone feel welcome. Jake's leadership became a model for other businesses in the area, and he was even invited to speak at local events about the importance of empathy in leadership. But despite all the success, Jake remained grounded. He never forgot the journey that had brought him here, the mistakes he had made, the lessons he had learned, and the people who had helped him along the way. He continued to work alongside his team, ensuring that the values of kindness and respect remained at the heart of everything they did. One afternoon, as Jake sat in the office, looking out over the bustling dining room, he thought about how far the restaurant had come. He thought about Mrs. Hart, the woman who had given him a second chance when he had been at his lowest. She had trusted him, believed in him, and had shown him the power of kindness. Jake had taken that lesson to heart, And now, it was a lesson that he passed on to everyone who walked through the restaurant doors. And so, the cycle continued, new faces joining the team, new guests walking in, all becoming part of the restaurant's ever-growing story. The restaurant wasn't just a place to eat, it was a place where lives were changed, where people were seen and heard, and where kindness was always on the menu. As Jake watched the restaurant continue to thrive, he knew that this was just the beginning. The journey wasn't over, and the lessons would continue to unfold. But he also knew that he had created something lasting, something that would continue to impact lives for years to come. In the end, Jake realized that the greatest legacy he could leave behind wasn't a thriving business or a reputation for excellent food. It was the way he had helped others see the value in themselves. That, more than anything, was the mark of true success. And so, with every meal served, every guest greeted, and every new team member mentored, Jake knew he was living the legacy of kindness and leadership that had been passed down to him, and he was proud to be a part of it. Years passed, and the restaurant continued to grow in ways that Jake had never imagined. It had become more than just a place to eat, it had become a community. The bonds between the staff, the guests, and the people in the surrounding neighborhood were unbreakable. What had started as a simple mission to improve customer service had blossomed into something far greater, a legacy of compassion and connection. One crisp autumn evening, as Jake stood by the door greeting guests, a familiar face walked in. It was Mrs. Hart, the woman who had taken a chance on him all those years ago. She hadn't been to the restaurant in months, and Jake's heart skipped a beat as he saw her approaching. She looked as dignified and wise as ever, but there was something different in her eyes, something that told Jake that she had come to reflect on the journey they had shared. "Mrs. Hart," Jake said, his voice filled with warmth, "it's so good to see you." She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Jake, it's been too long. I wanted to come by and see how everything is going. You've built something truly special here." Jake led her to a table by the window, the same one where they had sat all those years ago during their first conversation. He pulled out a chair for her and took a seat across from her. "I can't thank you enough for giving me the chance all those years ago," Jake said, his voice sincere. "You've changed my life." Mrs. Hart's smile softened, and she reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "Jake, you've done the hard work. You took what I taught you and made it your own. You've made this place something I never could have imagined. You should be proud of yourself." Jake felt a lump in his throat as he looked around the restaurant, at the bustling staff and the smiling customers. "I don't know if I could have done it without you. You gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve it." Mrs. Hart shook her head gently. "I didn't give you a second chance, Jake. You gave yourself that chance. I simply provided the space for you to realize your potential." They sat in silence for a moment, each of them reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. Jake thought about the mistakes he had made, the challenges he had overcome, and the lessons that had shaped him into the leader he was today. He had learned to embrace failure, to use it as a stepping stone toward growth, and to lead with compassion and integrity. "Jake," Mrs. Hart said, breaking the silence, "I'm not going to be around forever. You know that. But I want you to understand something. This restaurant, this community you've built, is your legacy now. You've created something that will live on long after we're both gone." Jake's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Hart smiled gently. "I mean that the heart of this place is you. The kindness, the respect, the way you've built something that's about more than just food. It's about people. And that's what will continue to resonate with everyone who walks through those doors. It's a legacy of love, and that's the most important thing of all." Jake felt a deep sense of gratitude as he looked at Mrs. Hart, realizing that her wisdom had shaped him not just as a manager, but as a person. He had learned that leadership wasn't about control or authority, it was about serving others, inspiring them to be their best selves, and creating an environment where everyone felt valued. "I'll make sure that legacy continues," Jake said, his voice steady. "I promise." Mrs. Hart's smile grew wider. "I know you will. You've already proven that you have the heart for it." As the evening went on, they talked about the past, the present, and the future. Jake listened carefully to Mrs. Hart's stories, grateful for the years of wisdom she had shared with him. But there was one thing that stood out above all the rest, the reminder that kindness was the key to everything. As the night drew to a close, Mrs. Hart stood up, ready to leave. "Thank you, Jake, for letting me see how far you've come. I'm proud of you." Jake stood with her, offering his hand. "Thank you, Mrs. Hart. You'll always have a place here." She gave him a warm, knowing look before turning to leave. As she stepped out into the night, Jake watched her walk away, a sense of peace settling over him. He knew that her legacy had become a part of him and that the values she had instilled in him would live on, not just in the restaurant, but in every person whose life he touched. The restaurant continued to thrive, but it was no longer just a business, it was a place where the essence of humanity was celebrated. Every day, Jake made sure that the values of kindness, respect, and empathy were at the core of everything they did. And as the years passed, he saw how the impact of that culture spread, creating a ripple effect that touched not just the lives of the guests who walked through the doors, but the community as a whole. Jake had learned that true success wasn't about money or recognition, it was about making a difference. And in that, he had found the greatest reward of all. As the years went by, the restaurant's reputation continued to grow, not just as a local favorite, but as a symbol of community and compassion. Jake had built something that transcended the typical business model. It was a place where people could gather, share stories, and connect on a deeper level. The walls weren't just filled with the scent of delicious food. They were alive with laughter, conversation, and the warmth of shared experiences. Jake's leadership had evolved into something greater than just managing a successful business. He had become a mentor to others, guiding new restaurant owners, managers, and even individuals from different industries who sought his advice on building positive cultures. His story had inspired so many people to reevaluate what success truly meant. One day, a young woman walked into the restaurant, carrying a notebook and a pen, her eyes filled with determination. She had heard about Jake and his remarkable journey and had come to ask for his help. Her name was Lily, and she was the owner of a small cafe just starting to gain attention in the neighborhood. However, she felt that her business was stagnating, and she wasn't sure how to take it to the next level. Lily approached Jake, who was busy checking on the kitchen, making sure everything was running smoothly. She hesitated for a moment before gathering the courage to speak. "Excuse me, are you Jake?" she asked. Jake looked up and smiled warmly. "That's me. How can I help you?" Lily introduced herself and told him about her cafe, the struggles she was facing, and how she had heard about the culture he had built in his restaurant. She admitted that she felt overwhelmed and unsure of how to create the kind of environment that would bring people back, not just for the food, but for the experience. Jake listened carefully, nodding thoughtfully. "I can see you care about your business, and that's the first step. You're not just trying to serve food. You want to create something meaningful. And that's exactly how it all starts." Lily seemed to relax a little, encouraged by Jake's understanding. "But where do I start? How do I turn this around?" Jake leaned forward, his voice gentle but confident. "Start with your team. They're the backbone of everything. If you want your guests to feel cared for, your team needs to feel that same level of respect and support. Build a culture where kindness, empathy, and connection are the priorities. When you treat your staff like family, they'll do the same for your guests." Lily took out her notebook, jotting down notes quickly. "That makes sense. But what about the guests? How do I create that connection with them?" "Treat them like people, not customers," Jake said, his eyes bright with passion. "It's about more than just serving them food, it's about making them feel seen and valued. Take the time to ask them about their day, their lives. Show genuine interest. When they feel like they matter, they'll come back." Lily nodded eagerly. "I can do that. But what if things don't change right away?" Jake smiled reassuringly. "It takes time, but the key is consistency. If you keep showing up for your team and your guests with the same level of care every day, they'll notice. It won't be long before you see the kind of impact you want." The conversation lasted for hours, with Jake offering advice on everything from team-building exercises to the importance of leading by example. Lily left the restaurant that evening with a new sense of purpose, her mind buzzing with ideas and plans. Over the next few months, Lily implemented the changes Jake had suggested. She focused on fostering a supportive environment for her staff, taking the time to get to know each person and ensuring they felt valued. She also made an effort to connect with her guests on a personal level, learning their names, remembering their preferences, and making sure they felt welcome every time they walked in. Slowly but surely, her cafe began to change. The atmosphere became warmer, more inviting. Guests started returning not just for the food, but for the experience. Word of mouth spread, and soon, Lily's cafe became known as a place where people felt at home, where they were more than just customers, they were part of the family. One evening, months later, Lily returned to Jake's restaurant. This time, she was beaming with pride. She approached Jake at the counter, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Jake, I just wanted to thank you. Your advice changed everything. My cafe is thriving now. People keep telling me how much they love the atmosphere, and I can see the difference in my team. They're happier, and that makes all the difference." Jake smiled, proud of her success. "You did the hard work, Lily. I just helped you see what was possible. It's amazing to see how far you've come." Lily gave him a grateful look. "I'll never forget how you helped me. I'll keep passing on what you taught me. You've created something incredible here, and I hope to do the same in my cafe." Jake's heart swelled with pride as he watched Lily leave, knowing that he had played a small part in her success. It wasn't just about the restaurant anymore, it was about creating a ripple effect, where kindness and empathy spread to others, and the legacy of positive leadership continued to grow. As the years went on, Jake's influence expanded beyond the restaurant and the neighborhood. His story had become a beacon of hope for many, proving that success was not just about profits, but about the way you treated people. His legacy, built on the foundation of compassion, would continue to inspire future generations of leaders, no matter the industry. And in the end, that was all Jake had ever wanted: to make a difference, to show others that kindness and respect were the keys to true success, and to leave a legacy that would endure long after the last plate was cleared from the table. Years after Lily's transformation and the continued success of the restaurant, Jake stood by the window one quiet evening, watching the last few guests leave the restaurant. The atmosphere was calm now, but earlier, it had been filled with laughter, conversation, and the hum of busy activity. It was the kind of night that reminded him of how far he had come and how far the restaurant had come with him. Jake's journey had never been linear. There had been setbacks, doubts, and times when it felt like the dream he was chasing might slip away. But with every challenge, he had found a way to rise, learning from his mistakes and embracing the power of kindness, empathy, and humility. The restaurant was no longer just a business, it had become a testament to what was possible when you led with your heart. As Jake looked around the space that had once been a place of failure and frustration, he realized it was now a place where people came not just for food, but for connection. The community that had formed around the restaurant was one that had been built on respect and trust, where guests felt welcome and employees felt valued. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was what made it special. That evening, a letter arrived at the restaurant, a letter that Jake never expected. It was from Mrs. Hart, the woman who had given him a second chance all those years ago. She had been in poor health for a while, and Jake had heard through the grapevine that her time was nearing. As he opened the letter, he could feel his heart tighten. He knew what it meant. The letter was short but full of meaning. "Jake, I've watched you grow and succeed, and I am so proud of the person you've become. You've done more than I could have ever hoped for. The kindness you've shared, the way you've built a community, this is your legacy. Remember, the world is better because of people like you. I'm so glad I gave you that chance all those years ago. Thank you for being the man you are." Jake sat quietly for a moment, holding the letter in his hands. Tears welled up in his eyes, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. Mrs. Hart had been more than a mentor, she had been a guiding light, teaching him that leadership was about far more than authority or success. It was about making a difference in the lives of others, creating spaces where people could be themselves and feel valued. In the days that followed, Jake found himself reflecting on the lessons he had learned over the years. He thought about the moments when he had doubted himself, when he had been on the brink of giving up, and how each of those moments had shaped the leader he had become. It wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. It was about showing up every day with the intention to make a positive impact, no matter how small the action seemed. Jake's restaurant had become a model for others in the industry. People came from all over to see how he had built such a thriving business based on values of kindness, respect, and empathy. He was invited to speak at conferences, write articles, and even mentor other restaurant owners. But through it all, Jake remained grounded. He never lost sight of the simple truth that had guided him from the beginning: people matter. One day, Jake decided it was time to make another change. He began the process of transitioning the leadership of the restaurant to his longtime team members, those who had been with him through the thick and thin, those who had embraced his philosophy and helped carry it forward. It wasn't an easy decision, but Jake knew it was the right one. He had built something that could stand on its own, and now it was time to pass the torch to those who shared his vision. In his final speech as the restaurant's manager, Jake stood in front of his team and the guests who had gathered for a special event. He looked around at the faces of the people who had helped him turn his dream into a reality. "I've been blessed beyond measure," Jake began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This restaurant is not just a place, it's a community built on kindness, respect, and the belief that every person deserves to be seen and heard. None of this would have been possible without each and every one of you." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "I'm handing over the reins today because I believe in you. I know that you will continue to lead with the same heart, the same dedication, and the same commitment to our values. The future of this restaurant is in good hands, and no matter where I go from here, I will always carry this place and all of you with me." The room was filled with applause, but Jake's eyes were on the faces of the people who had helped him build this legacy. He knew that the values they have created together would continue to guide the restaurant, no matter what. As the years passed, the restaurant remained a beloved staple in the community. It continued to be a place where people gathered, celebrated, and shared moments of connection. Jake, though no longer at the helm, remained a constant presence, still offering advice, still mentoring, and still living out the lessons he had learned. The legacy of kindness and compassion that Jake had built continued to inspire not just his team, but everyone who had walked through the doors of the restaurant. His story had become a reminder that success isn't about how much you earn or how many accolades you receive. It's about the lives you touch, the people you help, and the love you give along the way. In the end, Jake had learned that the greatest success of all was knowing that he had made a difference that would echo through the generations to come, not just in the restaurant, but in the hearts of the people whose lives he had touched. If you were inspired by Jake's story and the impact of kindness and leadership, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who need a reminder of what truly matters, and subscribe for more stories that prove that empathy can change the world. Thank you for watching, and remember, it's not just about what you achieve, it's about the lives you touch along the way.